The cold came first, before the dark, before the silence, before the small folded note taped to the front door of the row house on Pine Street. The cold came first, and Neve Riordan stood on the front porch with a cardboard box at her feet, and she understood that some kinds of cold are not about the weather. It was February in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the kind of February that lives in the marrow of the Lackawanna Valley, the kind that smells like coal smoke and old snow, and the diesel that still drifts down from the rail yards even though the yards have been mostly quiet for 40 years. She was 20 years old. She was wearing a black wool pea coat with a torn pocket and a pair of work boots that had once belonged to her father. She had finished a closing shift at the diner on Wyoming Avenue at 11:15, and she had walked the 7 blocks home through the empty streets, and now she stood on the porch where she had stood 10,000 times before, and the door was locked. The cardboard box was the kind that holds reams of office paper. Someone had taken the time to fold the flaps neatly. Inside the box were her clothes, folded the way her mother used to fold them when Neve was small, her textbooks from senior year, the framed photograph of her father, Cillian Riordan, in his Conrail jacket taken the spring before he died, a small leather pouch that held 3 pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother, and on top of the box, set carefully in the very center, was the silver pocket watch. The watch was the one her grandfather Declan had carried in the breast pocket of his denim work shirt every day for 32 years. A flat-topped silver hunting case on a worn leather cord, scratched along the rim, the engraving on the back nearly rubbed smooth. It had been set to railroad time, accurate to within 10 seconds a year for as long as anyone in the family could remember. She had kept it on a leather cord around her neck since the day after her grandfather's funeral, and on the night she did not wear it, she kept it in the top drawer of her dresser, wrapped in a square of clean flannel. The watch was on top of the box, which meant her stepfather had gone into her room, which meant he had opened the dresser drawer, which meant he had taken the watch from its flannel and carried it down the stairs and laid it on top of the cardboard box deliberately so that when she came home and saw the box on the porch, she would understand without having to read anything that this was not a misunderstanding. This was a closing of a door. Taped to the front door at eye level was a folded sheet of lined notebook paper. Neve did not pick it up right away. She stood very still on the cold porch boards and looked at the watch on top of the box. The chain was coiled around the case in the careful spiral her grandfather had always used when he took it off at the end of a shift. Whoever had laid the watch on the box had not known how to coil the chain. The spiral was wrong. It was the wrong direction. It was the small wrong direction of a man who had handled the watch only enough to know that it was an object and not a life. She unfolded the note. The handwriting was her mother's. The ink was a little smeared on the bottom line, as if a tear had fallen and been wiped away with the side of a hand. Neve, Roland and I have decided this is the best thing for everyone. You are an adult now. We need our own space. Please do not come back tonight or any night. Please do not call, Mom. She read the note once. She folded it along the same crease and slid it into the inside pocket of the peacoat. She tried the front door. Locked. She walked around to the back door past the snow shovel her grandfather had bought in 1994. Locked. She tried the side door that opened into the basement from the alley. Locked. She tried the basement bulkhead doors that had not been locked in 20 years. They were locked now. New padlocks still bright from the hardware store. All of them locked. All of them in the same single afternoon. Neve picked up the cardboard box. She lifted the silver pocket watch off the top and slipped the leather cord over her head and tucked the watch under her sweater so that it lay against her collarbone, where it had lain for almost 2 years. She felt the cold metal warm slowly against her skin. She did not cry. Crying was a private weather and not the right answer to a closed door. She walked. She walked the 11 blocks from Pine Street down through the empty side streets of central Scranton, past the boarded windows of the old DL and W Roundhouse, past the long brick wall of the Steamtown Yards, where her grandfather had once shown her the difference between a 482 Mountain and a 484 Northern, past the closed pawn shops and the closed insurance agencies and the closed bakery where her father had bought her a black and white cookie every Saturday morning of her childhood. The cardboard box grew heavier with each block. The watch grew warmer. Her breath rose in white plumes that the cold scattered before they could finish forming. She walked because there was somewhere to walk to. There was a diner on the corner of Wyoming Avenue and Linden Street called Stefania's. The neon sign in the window said open until midnight most nights. It had said that for 31 years. It was 11:52 when Neve pushed open the front door with her hip and stepped inside, and the small bell above the door rang once, and Stefania Novak looked up from the back booth where she was reading the morning's Times Tribune, with her reading glasses balanced on the end of her nose, and Stefania saw Neve's face, and Stefania set the paper down on the table. She got up. She did not say anything. She walked to the front of the diner. She turned the small cardboard sign in the window from open to closed. She walked past Neve and slid the deadbolt on the front door. She came back and took the cardboard box out of Neve's arms and set it on the counter beside the cash register. She gestured to the back booth. Sit, Stefania said. That was all. Neve sat. Stefania Novak was 62 years old. She had been widowed twice, once at 28 by a steelworker who had fallen from a Bethlehem steel coke battery, and once at 51 by a Conrail switchman who had simply gone to sleep one Tuesday night and not woken up. She wore her gray hair in a single braid down her back. She had thick forearms from 45 years of carrying plates. She kept a shotgun in the small office above the diner that no one had ever seen her load, but no one in Scranton had ever tried to rob the place either. She ran the diner the way she ran her own life, with strong coffee and few wasted words, and an unspoken understanding that the people who came through her door were carrying things they did not always want to talk about. She made eggs. She made home fries. She made bacon. She poured coffee into a thick white mug. She set it all in front of Neve in the back booth and slid into the bench on the opposite side and folded her hands and did not speak. Neve ate. She ate slowly. She ate the way a person eats who has not quite registered yet that she is hungry. Stefania watched her eat and said nothing at all for the entire plate. When the plate was empty, Stefania refilled the coffee mug from the carafe she had set on the table without Neve seeing her do it. Tell me, Stefania said. Neve told her. She told her about the cardboard box and the locked doors and the silver pocket watch laid wrong on top. She told her about the note in the smeared ink. She told her about the 8 months since her mother had married Roland Trumbull and the slow cold filling of the row house. She told her about the way Roland had begun to leave the kitchen when she walked into it. She told her about the morning he had put a separate carton of milk in the refrigerator with his own initials marked on the cap in blue Sharpie because he did not want her drinking from it. She told her about her mother's eyes, which had stopped meeting hers 6 months ago and had not met them since. It took her almost an hour to tell. Stefania did not interrupt. She refilled the coffee twice. She brought a piece of potchki on a small plate at one point and set it in front of Neve without comment. When Neve was finished, Stefania was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen clock above the pass-through window ticked. The radiator under the booth window hissed. The ice machine in the back hummed and shuddered and dropped a load of cubes. Then Stefania said, "I knew your grandfather." Neve looked up. "I know, he used to come in here every Saturday morning from 1981 until 2018. 37 years. 2 over-easy wheat toast black coffee, no home fries because he said home fries were for Sundays." He sat at the counter on the third stool from the door. He always laid that watch right there on the counter beside his plate. He set his watch by the kitchen clock and the kitchen clock by his watch. We argued about which one was more accurate for 37 years. Neve's hand went to the watch through the front of her sweater. She held it. The cold had gone out of the metal. It felt like a small, warm heart against her chest. "He told me about you," Stefania said. "When you were born, when you started kindergarten, when your father died. He was in here the morning after the funeral. He sat on his stool and he ordered his eggs, and he could not eat them. He pushed the plate away. It was the only time I ever saw him do that. He looked at me and he said, 'Stefania, I have buried my son. There is no order to this.' And then he picked the plate back up and he ate, because that is what a railroad man does." Neve was crying now, quietly. The watch was warm against her collarbone. Stefania did not reach across the table. She did not say anything sentimental. She let her cry. When the crying was over, Stefania said, "There is a room above the diner. It has been empty since my second husband died in 2015. It is small. The bed is an iron cot. The bathroom is shared with the storage closet. The window looks out over the alley and the back wall of the bakery. You will live there, starting tonight. You will work the morning shift Tuesday through Saturday. You will not pay rent. The rent is the work. The work is the rent. We do not negotiate." Neve tried to speak. Stefania held up one hand. "Reardon girl, do not make me explain. Some debts are older than you." She did not make Stefania explain. The room above Stefania's diner had a single window with a checked curtain Stefania had sewn herself in 1993. There was an iron cot with a striped wool blanket. There was a small wooden dresser with a chip on the corner. There was a cast iron radiator that clanked when it warmed up, but threw heat the way the old radiators do, the kind of dry, deep heat that goes into the bones. Stefania had laid out a fresh bar of lavender soap on the small bathroom shelf because Neve had once mentioned 8 months earlier in passing, while wiping down a table, that her grandmother had used lavender soap. Neve slept in that small upstairs room for 2 months. She worked the morning shift. She busted ice from the walk-in. She rolled silverware and paper napkins. She wiped down the counter where her grandfather had sat for 37 years. She poured coffee for the old men who came in at 5:30 in the work boots and the canvas Carhartt jackets, the railroad retirees, and the steel retirees, and the coal retirees, the men who carried the city of Scranton in their hands and their backs. She learned their orders. She learned their wives' names. She learned which ones had lost children and which ones had lost wives and which ones had lost both. And she learned to pour the coffee a little slower for those ones, because a little slower is sometimes the only kindness you can give a man at 5:30 in the morning. She thought about her father every day. Cillian Riordan had been 36 years old when he died. He had been a track maintenance worker on the Conrail line north of Pittston. He had grown up listening to his father Declan tell the stories at the kitchen table about 32 years of riding cabooses through every kind of Pennsylvania weather, and he had told everyone he was going to do something different with his life, something that did not involve diesel fuel and frostbitten hands. For 2 years after high school, he had worked in a small insurance office in downtown Scranton, wearing a cheap necktie and a button-down shirt. Then on a Monday morning in March of 2003, he had walked into the office, set his nameplate carefully in the center of his desk, walked back out and applied for a job on the Conrail track maintenance crew that same afternoon. He had told Declan that night, sitting at the kitchen table in the row house, that the office had felt like wearing somebody else's coat. Declan had nodded once. He had reached into the breast pocket of his denim work shirt. He had taken out the silver pocket watch. He had slid it across the kitchen table to his son. He had said, "Then you keep this on you. A railroad man should always know what time it is." Cillian had married Maura Brady 2 years later. Neve had been born in the autumn of 2005. For the first 12 years of Neve's life, her father had come home every evening with grease on his hands and the sweet diesel smell of the rail yards in his hair. He had taught her how the switches worked. He had taught her the names of the different kinds of freight cars, boxcars, gondolas, hoppers, tank cars, reefers. He had taught her how to read a freight schedule. He had taught her that a railroad was the most honest kind of work there was, because steel does not lie, and gravity does not lie, and a train will arrive at a place at a particular time, or it will not, and there is nothing else to discuss. He had died on a cold morning in the cut north of Pittston in March of the year Neve was 12. The Conrail incident report said the cause was a broken rail in a frozen tie plate. Cillian had been on the ground crew responding to a derailed grain hopper when a second car had shifted off the rails above him. The report said death had been instantaneous. The report did not say whether his hand had been in the pocket where he kept the silver pocket watch. The watch had come home to Declan in a plastic bag with the rest of Cillian's effects, and Declan had cleaned it carefully with a soft cloth, and he had wound it, and he had set it back to railroad time, and he had carried it for 14 more months until the Sunday morning he had died in his armchair with the watch open on the table beside him. Neve had been 13 when she put the leather cord around her neck. She had been a Riordan in the only way that mattered ever since. In the small room above Stefania's diner, she slept with the watch on the chair beside the cot where she could see it when she woke. She wound it every morning. She set it by the small alarm clock Stefania had left on the dresser. She cleaned the case with a soft cloth on Sundays the way her grandfather had cleaned it. She did not let it out of her sight. The trouble was she could not stay forever. Stefania was 62, and the diner was getting harder for her to run alone, and the small room above it was meant for a younger version of Stefania, the version that had once lived up there with her first husband in 1985, before they had bought a house out near Dunmore. Neve did not want to become a person who needed somebody else to carry her. She started looking. An apartment in Scranton was out of the question on diner wages. She looked at rooms for rent in the rougher neighborhoods around the old Marvine Colliery and could not bring herself to take any of them. She looked at trailers for sale in lots out in Throop and Oliphant and could not afford the lot rent. She looked at small houses in the foreclosure listings and could not afford the down payment on a foreclosed house, which was a sentence that did not feel like it should be possible in the United States of America in the 21st century, but was. One Tuesday evening in the second week of February, she sat in the back booth with a cup of coffee gone cool. She had the diner's old laptop, the one Stefania had set up in 2014 for the customers to use and had never replaced. The keys were sticky. The screen had a crack in the upper left corner. Neve typed cheapest property Pennsylvania into the search engine just to see what came up. The first 4 results were the kind of listings you expect. Small parcels of overgrown land in counties she had never heard of. A tax sale row house in Erie. A double wide in Cambria County with no plumbing. The 5th result was different. It was a county surplus auction page from a place called Penn Forest Township, the Allegheny foothills north of Bedford. The page listed 11 abandoned buildings being sold for nominal fees ahead of a planned demolition the following spring. A Grange Hall, a one-room schoolhouse, a creamery, a blacksmith shop, a dance pavilion. Near the bottom of the list was an entry that made Neve stop scrolling and read it 3 times. Former Penn Central slash PRR Branch Line Depot, Slate Brook Junction, abandoned 1958, scheduled for demolition spring of next year. Asking price $10. She did not move for a long moment. She read the listing a 4th time. She read it a 5th. She walked the laptop to the back booth and turned it around so that Stefania could see the screen. Stefania was wiping down the counter. She came over slowly. She put on her reading glasses. She bent over the screen for almost a minute. She straightened up. She looked at Neve. Slate Brook Junction, Stefania said. The way she said it made Neve's chest tighten. You know it. I know the line, the Bedford branch. Your grandfather rode that line in 1953 and 1954 when the Pocono Division loaned him out for 2 seasons. He was 19 years old. He was the youngest brakeman on the assignment. He lived in a boarding house in Bedford, and he worked the through freights all the way down to a junction in the foothills where the line dead-ended at a little depot in the woods. Stefania paused. She took off her glasses and folded them and set them on the table, and she did not look away from Neve. He told me about it once. He said the station agent at the junction made the best coffee on the division. He said the man had been there since 1932, and he made a pot every morning at 5 and gave a cup to anyone on the through freights who wanted one. He said the depot was the loneliest stop on the line. He said you could stand on the platform at midnight and hear the river, but not a single other thing. Neve's hand had gone to the watch through the front of her sweater. She did not remember moving it. The watch was warm. The watch was always warm now. What was the agent's name, she said. Stefania thought for a moment. Pritchard. Ezekiel Pritchard. Your grandfather always called him Mr. Pritchard, even 30 years later when he was telling the story. He said the man had a way of standing on the platform when the train pulled in that made you feel like you had arrived somewhere on purpose. The watch was very warm now. Stefania, Neve said, I think I'm going to go look at it. Reardon girl, Stefania said, I think you are too. Take the bus tomorrow. I'll mark you down for 2 days. The bus from Scranton to Bedford took most of a day with 2 transfers, one in Harrisburg and one in Altoona. The final leg was a county shuttle that ran twice a week and dropped passengers at a crossroads 4 miles from the township office. Neve rode the shuttle with 2 old women returning from a doctor's appointment in Altoona and a man in his 30s with a tool belt who did not speak. The shuttle let her out at the crossroads at 1:15 in the afternoon. The driver pointed down a county road that ran east into a narrow valley of bare winter hardwood. The driver said 4 miles. The township office is a frame building beside the closed general store. You can't miss it. He drove away. She walked. It was the kind of cold that makes the inside of your nose hurt. The valley was narrow and steep-sided, and the bare hardwood ridges rose on both sides like the ribs of a thing that had been alive a long time ago. The road wound along the bottom of the valley beside a small, fast creek that was running black between the ice shelves on its banks. The air smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke. There was no traffic. There was no sound except the creek and the wind in the high branches and the soft rhythmic crunch of her own boots on the gravel shoulder. The pocket watch ticked against her collarbone the whole way. She thought of her grandfather walking this same road in 1953. He had been 19 years old. He had been 1 year younger than she was now. He had walked it at the start of his Bedford branch assignment with a canvas duffel and a borrowed copy of the timetable and a heart full of the same tired determination that was carrying her now. She tried to imagine him at 19. She had only ever known him as an old man. She tried to put his old face on a young body, and she could not quite do it, but she could feel him beside her on the road. She could feel the leather cord at her neck like his hand on her shoulder. The Penn Forest Township office was a small frame building beside a closed general store on a single main street with 7 other buildings on it. 3 of the 7 were boarded up. 2 had been converted to apartments. One was a small post office. One had a hand-painted sign reading "Antiques by Appointment" that looked like it had not been honored by an actual appointment in a decade. There was no traffic light. There was a single stop sign at the only intersection, and the sign was so faded that the word "stop" was barely legible. The bell above the township office door jingled when Neve pushed it open. Inside, behind a wooden counter, sat a woman in her early 50s named Margaret Bachman. She wore a wool cardigan in a deep slate blue. Her gray hair was pinned in a loose bun. She had a mug of tea steaming on the counter beside a stack of property records. She looked up over the top of her own reading glasses and saw Neve, and her face did not change at all, but something behind her eyes registered something she had not been expecting to see today. "You came about the depot," Margaret said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "You walk from the crossroads?" "Yes, ma'am." "You know it's been closed since 1958. "Yes, ma'am." "You know the roof over the freight room is half gone. The track was pulled up in 1961. There's no power and no water at the depot itself, although there is a hand pump well behind it that the county inspector says is sound. The county is going to take the building down in March." "Yes, ma'am." "Why do you want it?" Neve thought about how to answer the question. She thought about her father with grease on his hands. She thought about her grandfather sliding the silver watch across the kitchen table in 2003. She thought about her great-grandfather, whose name she had only ever heard spoken at funerals, who had worked the section gang in Lackawanna County and had died of black lung before her grandfather was 18. She thought about a man named Ezekiel Pritchard, who had stood on a platform in 1953 and had given her grandfather a cup of coffee on a cold morning. She thought about all of them at the same time, all of those Pennsylvania men who had lived their lives by railroad time, and she touched the watch through the front of her sweater, and she said, "Because I have $10 and there is nowhere else." Margaret Bachman looked at her for a long moment. Then Margaret reached behind her to a shelf that held a row of leather-bound deed books, and she pulled down a book that had been waiting on that shelf for a long time. She opened it to a page that had been waiting in that book even longer. She turned the book around so it faced Neve on the counter. She set a heavy black ink pen beside it. "Sign here, and here, and here." Neve signed the Neve Mary Reardon in the careful slanted hand her grandfather had taught her, the same hand he had used to sign his name on every Conrail timesheet for 40 years. The same hand he had used to write the only letter Neve had ever received from him, which had arrived on her 9th birthday, and which she still kept folded in the inside cover of her father's old timetable. She signed her name 3 times. She set the pen down. Margaret took the $10 bill that Neve handed her. She folded it once. She tucked it into a small metal cash box. She turned a brass stamp over in her hand and pressed it down on the deed page. The stamp made a soft, flat sound, the kind of sound that closes one part of a story and opens another. "It's yours," Margaret said. She reached down behind the counter and brought up an old skeleton key on a length of frayed twine. She held it out across the counter. "It's a mile and a half down the old rail bed if you walk it. You want to ride? My husband Werner has the truck out front. He can drop you and come back for you in the morning." The truck was a dark green Ford F-150 from the late 90s. Werner Bachman was a man of about 60 with a closely trimmed gray beard and the silent, steady manner of a man who had spent a lifetime doing things with his hands. He did not introduce himself. He nodded once. He drove. The road from the township office turned off the county road onto a dirt lane that had once been the rail bed, and the dirt lane ran straight as a rail bed runs on a slight grade up the valley between the ridges of bare hardwood. A mile and a half, the truck rounded a slow curve and the lane widened into a clearing, and Nav saw the depot for the first time. It was smaller than she had imagined. It was also somehow larger. It was a single-story building of dark red board and batten siding, faded to the color of dried clay. The shingle roof was peaked with a tall brick chimney rising from the back wall. A wide overhanging eave ran the length of the platform side. The platform itself was still there, made of weathered boards green with moss along the joints. Beyond the platform, the rail bed ran away into the woods in a long, straight scar where the ties and the rails had been pulled up 60 years ago. The ballast still showed in patches where the leaves had not yet covered it. A small bay window projected from the front of the building toward the empty rail bed. The window was the ticket office. Above the window, painted in faded white letters on a dark green board, was the original sign Slate Brook JCT. Penn R.R. Werner stopped the truck. He did not get out. He looked at Neve. The padlock takes the key. There's a bench inside that'll do for sleeping if you've got a sleeping bag in that duffel. There's a stove. There's a flue. The flue's clear. I checked it last summer when the township talked about the demolition. Don't open the freight room door. The roof's bad on that side. I'll be back at 8 in the morning. He waited. Thank you, Neve said. Reardon girl, Werner said. It was the second time in a week that someone in Pennsylvania had called her that. It was the way her grandfather had been called by men who had known him a long time. Reardon, like the name was a thing earned, like it meant something. She got out of the truck. Werner backed up in the clearing, turned the truck around in two patient maneuvers, and drove back down the railbed lane the way he had come. The sound of the engine faded slowly into the trees, and then it was gone, and then there was nothing. She stood in the clearing, alone with the depot. The wind moved in the bare hardwood ridges. The creek that she could no longer see but only hear ran somewhere down the slope behind the building. A crow called once from very high up and very far away, and was answered by another crow even farther away. She walked toward the depot. The platform boards groaned softly under her boots. She put her hand on the painted sign above the bay window, low enough that her fingertips just reached the bottom edge. The paint was crackled and lifting in places. She could feel the grain of the wood underneath. She kept her hand there for a long moment. She did not know why. The padlock on the waiting room door was old, but not original. The hasp had been replaced sometime in the 1980s. The skeleton key Margaret had given her turned in the old door lock easily, but the door itself was swollen in its frame. She had to lean her shoulder against it. It opened with a soft sigh, the sob of a building that had been holding its breath for 68 years. The waiting room was a single long rectangular space. The slate floor had been scuffed soft by 60 years of feet and then 60 more years of nothing. The wainscoting on the walls was dark-stained pine oiled long ago, and dust had settled into it the way dust settles on velvet. A long wooden bench ran the length of one wall, with the gentle hollow worn into its seat that comes from thousands of waiting passengers across thousands of mornings and evenings. A black pot-bellied stove stood in the corner, cold and patient, its iron door slightly ajar. The stovepipe rose to the ceiling and bent into a crooked elbow before disappearing into the chimney bricks. The air smelled like cold cinder and old paper and the faint, sweet smell of pine boards. At the far end of the room beneath the bay window was a closed wooden door set into the wall. The door was painted the same dark green as the depot sign outside. The brass knob was tarnished to almost black. The door was the door of the ticket office. Neve walked the length of the waiting room slowly. She walked the way you walk in a church when you have not been in a church in a long time. She put her hand on the cold iron of the pot-bellied stove. She put her hand on the worn wood of the bench. She walked past the bench to the door at the end of the room. She put her hand on the brass knob. She turned it. The latch released with a small metallic click that seemed very loud in the stillness. The ticket office was about 6 feet square. A high wooden agent's desk faced the bay window, set at the height where a man could stand at it and see clearly down the line in either direction without having to bend. A tall wooden stool stood behind the desk. A row of pigeonhole cubbies was built into the wall above the desk for waybills and timetables and receipts. A small iron safe with a combination dial sat on the floor in the corner. The dial was set to 0. The handle was up. A chalkboard was mounted to the wall to the right of the desk, the kind of small wooden frame slate board that school teachers used to use. On the chalkboard, in a faint white chalk that had survived 68 winters of cold and damp and silence, was a single line in a small, careful, slanted hand. 6:42 p.m. eastbound. Final. Neve stood in the doorway and looked at the line of chalk, and she did not move for a long moment. She walked into the ticket office. She slid up onto the wooden stool behind the agent's desk. The seat of the stool was hollow-worn, the same way the seat of the waiting bench was hollow-worn, but the hollow on the stool was deeper and more local, the shape of a single set of haunches, the shape of one man across 26 years. Through the bay window, she could see straight down the empty railbed where the train had once come in from the east at 6:42 in the evening on a Friday in the third week of June in 1958. She could see the bend in the railbed where the line curved out of sight into the trees. She could imagine the long, low whistle. She reached up to the top of the leather cord around her neck and pulled the silver pocket watch out from under her sweater. She laid it on the agent's desk. The watch read 4:27. The afternoon was getting on. The light through the bay window was already beginning to slant. She looked down at the floor. The floor of the ticket office was old pine, the same as the floor of the waiting room. But the boards directly beneath the stool, the boards beneath where her feet were resting, were a slightly different color than the surrounding boards. They were darker, not by much, just a shade, just enough that in the slanting afternoon light coming through the bay window, the outline of a small rectangular section of floor showed faintly against the rest like a shape under fresh paint. Neve slid off the stool. She knelt down on the old pine. She ran her fingertips along the line where the darker boards met the lighter ones. She felt the gap. It was a deliberate gap, smooth cut, the kind of gap that does not happen by accident over 68 years of expansion and contraction. The kind of gap a man cuts on purpose with a fine-tooth saw because he means to come back later and lift the boards. Her heart was beating in a way it had not beat all day. She stood up. She walked back out into the waiting room. She crossed to the freight room door, which Werner had told her not to open, and she opened it just enough to look inside. The freight room was a wreck. Half the roof was gone. Snow had blown in. The floor was warped and stained. But against the far wall, leaning in a corner, was a piece of flat iron about 3 feet long, pointed at one end. The kind of iron that might once have been part of a switch lever or a brake rod, abandoned when the rails were pulled in 1961. She picked it up. It was heavy in her hand. The cold of it bit into her palm through her glove. She carried it back into the ticket office. She knelt again on the old pine. She slid the pointed end of the iron into the seam where the darker boards met the lighter ones. She put her weight on the other end of the iron. The boards resisted for a long moment, the way a thing resists that has been waiting to be opened for a long time. And then with a soft, splintering complaint, the boards came up. They came up together. A small section about 18 inches square. They were hinged on a single pair of leather hinges that had hardened with age but had not broken. The boards lifted as a single panel like the lid of a small cellar. Neve set the iron aside. She looked down into the compartment beneath the floor. It was lined with cedar. The cedar still smelled faintly of itself after 68 years. Inside, lying on a piece of folded oilcloth that had darkened with age, were three things. They had been arranged with where in a way that meant a man had taken his time. A small tin lockbox of the sort that station agents had once used to keep the day's cash before the night train. A thick cream paper envelope sealed with brown wax and addressed in a careful slanted hand. And a 48-star American flag neatly folded in the triangular military fold, the kind of fold that goes to a widow at a graveside, the small flag that is older than her grandfather had been when the last passenger train had run. The envelope was addressed in 5 words. To whoever finds this. Neve did not breathe. She lifted the envelope. She lifted the small tin lockbox. She lifted the folded flag. She set all 3 on the floorboards beside the open compartment. The light through the bay window had turned the color of bronze. The afternoon was going. The old depot was very quiet around her. The pocket watch on the agent's desk above her ticked softly, a small, steady heart in the silence of a building that had been waiting 68 years for someone to walk down the rail bed in the cold and sit on a wooden stool and notice that the floorboards did not match. Her hand was shaking. She climbed up off the floor with the 3 objects in her arms and set them on the agent's desk above her beside her grandfather's silver pocket watch. She sat on the wooden stool. She looked at them for a long time before she opened anything. She broke the seal on the envelope first because the envelope was the thing addressed to her, and she had been raised to answer a thing addressed to her before she opened a thing that was not. The wax cracked under her thumb. The paper inside was heavy cream stock, folded twice the ink brown with age, but the handwriting clear and careful. It was the small, careful, slanted hand of a man who had spent his life filling out waybills and timetables. It was dated June 17th, 1958, and signed at the bottom in the same hand Ezekiel Pritchard, station agent, Slatebrook Junction. She read it slowly, the way her grandfather had taught her to read anything that mattered, which was once for the meaning and once for the man. To whoever finds this. My name is Ezekiel Pritchard. I have been the station agent at Slatebrook Junction on the Bedford branch of the Pennsylvania Railroad from 1932 until today. The branch line is being closed at the end of this week. The last passenger train will run on Friday evening. After that, the rails will be pulled and the building will be locked, and there will be no reason for anyone to come here again. I am 64 years old and I have no children. My wife Eleanor passed in the influenza spring of 1949. I have spent my whole life at this small junction watching the trains come in from Bedford in the morning and go out toward Pittsburgh at night, and I have known every regular passenger by name. And I have made a pot of coffee every morning at 5 o'clock for the brakemen on the through freights, even though it was not part of my duties. I considered it my duty anyway. Coffee is a small kindness, and a small kindness on a cold morning is sometimes the difference between a good day and a hard one. I have saved a portion of every paycheck I ever drew in this lockbox beneath the floor of the booth where I have sat for 26 years. I do not trust banks. I lost what little I had in the failure of the Allegheny Bedford Savings Trust in 1933, and I have nowhere else to put what I have saved. The silver dollars are from Eleanor's family. The Hamilton was issued to me by the railroad in 1934, and I am leaving it behind because I do not want to carry railroad time after Friday. If you are reading this, you came into this depot after I am gone, maybe long after. Maybe the building has been forgotten. Maybe you came looking for shelter, or for quiet, or for a place to begin again. Whatever brought you here, I want you to know that the depot has been waiting for you. A small station is a kind of patient thing. It waits for the train, and then it waits for the next train, and then eventually when there are no more trains, it waits for whoever will come next. I have been the one waiting at Slate Brook Junction since 1932. I am leaving the waiting to you now. Take what is in this box. It is for you. The flag is from Eleanor's brother, who was a brakeman on the Erie and was killed in a coupling accident in 1944. Keep it folded the way I have folded it. Be kind to the building. The coffee tastes better here than anywhere on the division. I do not know why, and I have stopped trying to find out. Neve read the letter twice. She folded it carefully along its old creases and slid it back into the envelope. She set the envelope on the desk. Then she lifted the lid of the small tin lockbox. Inside, in neat rows banded with paper that crumbled at the edges when her thumb brushed it, were bundled banknotes. Old-style United States currency from the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, 20s and 50s, and a small stack of hundreds. She counted them slowly twice because she was afraid of getting the number wrong. The total was $9,320. Beneath the bills was a small leather pouch, the leather oiled and supple still, and inside the pouch were 11 silver dollars wrapped individually in tissue paper and a railroad pocket watch in a silver hunting case. She knew what the watch was before she opened it because she had been raised to know. It was a Hamilton 992B, the standard timepiece of every Pennsylvania railroad agent and conductor for 30 years. The same make and model that had hung around her grandfather Declan's neck on a leather cord every day of his 32 years on the line, and that hung now around her own neck, ticking softly against her collarbone. She set the Hamilton on the desk beside her grandfather's. The two watches looked nearly identical. They had been carried by men who had spent their lives believing that knowing the time was a kind of duty owed to other people, and the watches knew it. She did not cry. Her grandfather had not been a man who cried, and she had inherited his hands and his watch, and also his particular kind of restraint. But she said aloud to the empty depot, and to the man who had once sat on the same stool, the only thing she could think to say. "Thank you, Mr. Pritchard. I will trace." The bay window above her was streaked with the long winter dust of decades, and through it the railbed ran straight and empty into the bare hardwoods, and the late afternoon light was the cold pewter color that February light becomes in the Allegheny foothills. The depot was very still. Outside, somewhere up the valley, a single crow called once and was not answered. Neve sat on the stool a long time after the light had begun to fail. She wound the Hamilton and set it to railroad time by her grandfather's watch. Both watches read 4:59. The Hamilton's tick was very slightly slower than the silver watches, the way a watch ticks that has been sleeping for 68 years. By morning, she knew it would have caught up. She slept that first night in her sleeping bag on the slate floor of the waiting room, with the lockbox and the letter and the folded flag arranged on the bench beside her. She did not light the stove because she had not yet cleaned the flue and because she did not yet trust the chimney. She wore her pea coat and her wool hat and a pair of work gloves, and she was warm enough. The Hamilton ticked on the bench beside her ear all night, and the silver watch ticked against her collarbone. And somewhere beyond the bay window in the bare ridges, an owl called slowly and patiently, in a way that suggested it had been calling on this same stretch of woods since before the depot had been built. Werner came at 8 in the morning, as he had said he would, with a thermos of coffee and a brown paper bag containing 2 breakfast sandwiches Margaret had made. He sat with Neve in the waiting room and drank his coffee and looked at the lockbox and the letter and the flag without saying anything for a long time. When she had finished telling him what she had found, Werner Bachmann nodded slowly. "I will tell Margaret," he said. "Margaret will tell people who need to know." Pritchard had no living relatives that anyone in the township ever heard of. The lockbox was put there by a man for whoever found it. "You found it. It is yours under the deed and under any reasonable reading of the matter. Margaret will make sure the township records reflect that. Don't worry about it. Thank you, Mr. Bachman." Werner. Werner. He stood up. He put on his cap. He paused at the door. "There is a credit union in Bedford. They will rent you a small lockbox for $15 a year. If you take that money there and put it in their lockbox, you can draw on it when you need to. I would not leave it in this building. The county knows the depot was empty for 68 years. They do not know it is empty no longer. Word will get around. It is better if there is nothing here for word to get around about." She nodded. "And Neve?" "Yes. My wife says the chimney is sound, but the flue needs a brushing before you light the stove. There is a long-handled wire brush in the storage shed behind the township office. You are welcome to it. Bring it back when you are done." She nodded again. Werner Bachmann tipped his cap and walked out. The work began that morning, and it was Neve's work. This is important to understand. The men of Penn Forest Township came eventually, and they came in numbers and with kindness and with the particular quiet competence of men who had spent their lives doing useful things with their hands. But they came as helpers, not as rescuers. The rebuilding of Slate Brook Junction belonged to the 20-year-old woman who had walked 4 miles down a county road in February with $10 in her pocket, and the men who came later understood this without her having to say it, because men of that kind of competence usually do. She kept a small pocket notebook with a stubby pencil, and she made her list. The roof over the freight room had to be reframed and reshingled before the spring rains. The bay window had to be reglazed in 3 places. The pot-bellied stove needed its flue cleaned and its damper rehung. The well behind the depot needed a new hand pump, and the cistern beneath the platform needed to be checked for cracks. The waiting room door needed new hinges. The platform boards needed to be inspected and the rotten ones replaced. The chimney needed to be tuck-pointed. There were 41 items on her list when she finished it, and she crossed them off one at a time over the course of 7 months, and she did most of them herself. She did not spend Ezekiel Pritchard's money recklessly. She rented the small lockbox at the credit union in Bedford, as Werner had suggested, and she kept most of the bills there the way a person might keep something that was not entirely hers, and she withdrew small, careful amounts when the work demanded them. A bundle of cedar shingles, a bucket of roofing tar, a second-hand kerosene cook stove, a proper mattress, a wool blanket, 2 pairs of work gloves, a claw hammer, and a handsaw, and a box of galvanized nails. She bought tools the way her grandfather had taught her to buy tools, which was slowly and only when needed, because a tool you did not earn by needing it was a tool you would not respect. She learned to shingle a roof by watching videos on the public library computer in Bedford, riding the county shuttle the 11 miles each way, taking notes in her notebook and pencil, then walking back to the depot and making mistakes and correcting them. The first 6 shingles she laid were laid wrong. She pulled them up and laid them again. The next 12 were laid better. By the end of her first week of roof work, she had developed the steady kneeling rhythm of someone who had done it before, except that she had not, and the surprise of finding herself competent at something is a quiet pleasure that she had not expected. The people of Penn Forest Township began to notice her. Margaret Bachman came out every Wednesday afternoon in Werner's green pickup with a thermos of coffee and a copy of the township newsletter. Margaret was not a woman who fussed. She set the thermos on the platform bench, said good afternoon, and then walked the perimeter of the building with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at what had been done since the previous Wednesday and nodding at the things she approved of and frowning at the things she thought needed attention. She did not offer advice unless Neve asked for it. When Neve asked, Margaret answered carefully. She had grown up on a dairy farm 2 valleys over, and she knew about hand pumps and chimneys and the right way to bank a stove for the night. And she shared this knowledge in small, clean sentences that carried weight precisely because there were not many of them. Conrad Vogler arrived on the third Saturday of March. He drove out from the village in a 1987 Ford pickup that he had owned since it was new, and he parked at the edge of the clearing and walked up to the platform with his cap in his hand. He was 73 years old, German on his father's side, with the spare, upright posture of a man who had spent 40 years framing houses and had never quite given up the habit of standing as if he were measuring something. He had heard about the depot from Margaret, he said. He had been a journeyman carpenter in 3 counties, and he was retired now. And his wife had told him that morning over breakfast that he was beginning to drive her crazy in his retirement, and he wondered if Neve might let him help with the bay window. He did not want to be paid, he said, because being paid would make it work, and he had stopped doing work 3 years ago. He wanted to do this because he wanted to do it. Neve looked at him for a long moment. She said, Mr. Vogler, I have been trying to figure out the right way to set the new sashes for 2 weeks. I would be grateful for your help. Conrad nodded once. He came back the next Saturday with his own tools in a wooden box that had belonged to his grandfather, and he showed her how to chisel the old paint out of the sash channels and how to glaze a window properly with linseed putty and how to set the small finishing brads at the angle that would not split the soft pine of the Munten bars. He did not take over the work. He showed her how, and then he watched her do it, and then he went to the bench and drank the coffee she had made and let her finish on her own. When she finished, he looked at it carefully and said, "That is a good window now." And that was the highest compliment Conrad Vogler had given to any work in 15 years. And Neve knew it, and she did not say anything about it because she had also been raised by railroad men, and railroad men receive that kind of compliment by simply continuing the work. Wendell Ashworth came out the next Sunday afternoon. He was 68 years old, a retired Conrail locomotive engineer who lived 4 miles away in a small frame house up a hollow off the county road. He had heard from Margaret that a young woman was reopening the Slate Brook Depot, and he had spent his whole working life on the Bedford branch and the lines that fed it, and he had been keeping a wooden crate of railroad memorabilia in his attic for 37 years, because his wife had told him 40 years ago that he could not display any of it in the house, and he had never disagreed with her on the principle of the thing. Wendell drove up to the platform in his old Ford Bronco and unloaded the crate onto the bench. Inside were treasures, old PRR timetables from 1953 and 1954 and 1957, the paper soft and yellow but the printing still crisp, a brass conductor's lantern with a clear globe, a porcelain Pennsylvania Railroad coffee mug, one of the heavy white ones with the Keystone logo in dark red, a section of original 80-pound rail with the date 1928 stamped into the web, a canvas mail sack with the buckle still attached, a round metal sign that had once hung at the end of the platform reading Slatebrook Junction PR or 1932. He set the crate on the bench and said, "These belong here more than they belong in my attic. My wife says so too. She says I can have my afternoons back if I get them out of the house." Neve looked at the crate and felt her throat tighten in a way it had not tightened in a long time. The round metal sign was the original platform sign that had hung above the bay window. The faded green sign painted on the board above the bay had been the third one. This was the first. She said, "Mr. Ashworth, I do not know how to thank you for this." Wendell shrugged in the way that men of his generation shrugged when they did not know what to do with a thing that had moved them. "You hang the sign back up where it belongs," he said. "That is how you thank me." He came back every other Sunday for the rest of the spring, and he sat on the platform bench and drank coffee from the porcelain PRR mug and told her stories about the line. He told her about the Freyhound conductor who had run the Bedford branch for 19 years and had memorized every grade and curve so completely that he could tell you which mile post he was passing in pitch darkness, just by the sound of the wheels. He told her about the dispatcher in Altoona who had once held a train for 12 minutes because a passenger's wife had gone into labor, and the husband had been on the platform looking for a ride to the hospital, and the dispatcher had said over the radio that the rules of the railroad were one thing, but the rules of decency were another. He told her about Ezekiel Pritchard, whom he had met exactly once in 1957, when Wendell was 8 years old, and his father had brought him along on a fishing trip up the Bedford branch. They had stopped at Slatebrook Junction for coffee, and Ezekiel had given young Wendell a Hershey bar from the drawer of the agent's desk, and Wendell had remembered him for the rest of his life because of that single Hershey bar. He was a quiet man, Wendell said, but he was not lonely the way some people thought. There is a difference between being alone and being lonely, and Ezekiel knew the difference. He was alone. He liked it that way. But he was not lonely because the trains kept him company, and after the trains stopped, he had the memory of the trains, and that was enough for him. Neve listened, and she remembered her grandfather, and she understood. By the middle of May, the freight room roof was tight. By the middle of June, the bay window held new glass in all three sashes. By the end of June, the pot-bellied stove was clean and drawing properly, and the waiting room had a swept slate floor and a fresh coat of cream paint and a row of muslin curtains that Margaret had sewn at her kitchen table over 4 evenings. Neve had made a small bedroom for herself in the freight room with the iron cot and the wool blanket, and she had set the framed photograph of her father Cillian on the shelf above the cot, along with her grandfather's silver pocket watch on its leather cord. The Hamilton 992B from Ezekiel's lockbox she kept on the agent's desk in the ticket booth, wound and set to railroad time, the way Ezekiel would have kept it. She started serving coffee. It was not a business at first. It was just a thing she did the way Ezekiel had done it for the brakeman on the through freights, even though it was not part of his duties. She kept a kettle hot on the pot-bellied stove and a stack of mismatched mugs on the bay window shelf, and any walker who came down the old rail bed could come into the waiting room and have a cup. Hikers came, birders came. A railroad history club from Altoona came on a Saturday afternoon and stayed for 2 hours. A man who had been hiking the abandoned right-of-way as a personal project came through and stayed for the night in the freight room and left her 3 cans of soup and a hand-drawn map of the old branch line as it had existed in 1955. She did not charge. People left small things instead: a jar of honey, a loaf of bread wrapped in a tea towel, a folded $5 bill in a tin she had set on the bench, a handful of wildflowers in a mason jar. Stefania came down for a week in early June. She drove the long route through Harrisburg in her old Buick, and she arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with a trunk full of supplies that Neve had not asked for and would not have known how to ask for. A wool blanket for the cot that was a little finer than the one Neve had bought for herself, a cast iron skillet that had belonged to Stefania's mother and that Stefania said she did not use anymore, and that she wanted the skillet to go to a kitchen where it would be used. 6 mason jars of pickled cabbage, a small frame photograph of Neve's grandfather Declan that had been taken at the diner counter in 1996 and that Stefania had kept in a drawer in her office for 19 years. Stefania slept in the Freite room on a folding cot Neve had set up. She helped Neve paint the inside of the ticket booth a soft cream color that made the small space feel twice as big. She cooked 3 meals a day on the kerosene cook stove and the pot-bellied stove, and she fed Neve in the way that women who have lost children sometimes feed young women who are not their daughters, with a mixture of relief and ferocity that is its own kind of love. On her last morning, Stefania stood beside the Buick in the clearing and looked at the depot for a long time. She did not say anything sentimental. She did not say anything at all for almost a full minute. Then she said, Patrick would be proud. Eamon would be proud. Declan would be proud. Cillian would be proud. Patrick, Neve said. Your great-grandfather. Patrick Riordan. The first one. The one who came over from County Mayo in 1907 and went into the section gang in Lackawanna County. He died of black lung in 1949 when your grandfather was 15. Your grandfather talked about him sometimes at the counter. Patrick was the start of all of it. The Riordans on the railroad. He used to tell his sons that a railroad man should always know what time it is. Stefania paused. I do not think he ever owned a watch himself. He could not afford one. He was the reason your grandfather was given the silver one. The watch came up the line generation by generation. It started with a man who never had one. Neve stood in the clearing with the silver watch warm against her chest. She had not known that. Her grandfather had never told her where the watch had come from, only that it had been his since 1956 when the railroad had given it to him on his promotion to brakeman. He had not told her about Patrick. Stefania, she said, why do you know all this? Because Declan told me. Oh, come on, you. 37 years on a stool will make a man tell you things. Stefania looked at the depot one more time. Riordan girl, you are the daughter I never had. I am too old to say it any other way. I am going home now. Call me on the Wednesday phone if you need me. She got into the Buick. She drove away. Neve stood in the clearing for a long time afterward with the depot at her back and the rail bed running away into the trees and the silver watch warm against her collarbone, and she did not know what to do with the size of what Stefania had given her. She walked back into the depot eventually. She climbed up onto the stool in the ticket booth. She wound the Hamilton. She wound the silver watch. They both ran. They both kept time. They both still had work to do. It was on a hot afternoon in the second week of July that the silver Cadillac sedan came down the old railbed. Neve was on the platform at the time repairing a section of decking with Conrad's circular saw, which he had loaned her with the careful instruction that she should respect the saw and the saw would respect her. She heard the car before she saw it because the railbed was unpaved and the suspension of a Cadillac sedan does not love unpaved railbeds. The car came around the last curve at 5 miles an hour and it stopped in the clearing and a man got out. He was perhaps 45 years old, tall and well-built in a charcoal suit that had not been bought in Pennsylvania. His hair was iron gray and combed straight back, and his shoes were the kind of expensive English brogues that were not made for railbeds. He smiled at Neve in the way a man smiles when he has decided ahead of time to be charming. "You must be Miss Reardon," he said. His voice was smooth with the slight polished accent of a man who had learned to control his consonants in business school. "My name is Bartholomew Sterling. I represent Sterling Hospitality Group out of Pittsburgh. I have been hoping to meet you." Neve set down the circular saw. She wiped her hands on her work jeans. She did not offer to shake his hand because her hands were dirty, and also because something in his smile had told her in the first quarter second of seeing it that she did not want to shake his hand. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "what can I do for you?" He looked at the depot. He looked at the platform. He looked at the round metal sign that Niev had remounted above the bay window the previous week. He smiled the way a man smiles when he is appraising something. "This is a charming property, Miss Reardon. Truly charming. I want to compliment you on the work you have done here. I understand from the township that you purchased this building for $10 at last winter's surplus auction. Is that correct?" "That is correct, Mr. Sterling." "Wonderful. Wonderful. I love a story like that. Now I am going to be direct with you because I think you are the kind of person who appreciates directness. My company has been studying this part of Penn Forest Township for the past year. We have plans to develop a recreational property in this valley, a small resort, equestrian trails perhaps, some cabins, possibly a quarry concession on the ridge above. We are prepared to be generous with the property owners whose holdings we would need to consolidate." He paused. He smiled again. "I am prepared to offer you $80,000 for the depot and the surrounding parcel, Miss Reardon. Today, in cash if you prefer. That is 8,000 times what you paid for the property. I think you will agree it is a generous offer." Neve looked at him. She was 20 years old. She had had $10 in a duffel bag and a leather cord around her neck 5 months ago. $80,000 was an unimaginable sum of money. She could see from the way Bartholomew Sterling was watching her face that he expected her to be unable to imagine it, and that he expected the imagining itself to do most of his work for him. She thought about her grandfather Declan, who had ridden cabooses for 32 years through every kind of Pennsylvania weather. She thought about her father Cillian, who had walked out of an insurance office on a Monday morning in 2003 because the coat had felt like someone else's. She thought about Ezekiel Pritchard, who had hidden a lockbox under the floor of his ticket booth in 1958 because he had believed that the depot was a kind of patient thing that knew how to wait for the right person. She said, "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Sterling. The depot is not for sale." He blinked. The smile flickered, then steadied. "Miss Reardon, I do not think you have understood me. $80,000. I understood you, Mr. Sterling. The depot is not for sale." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly as if her refusal had only made the situation more interesting to him. "You are young," he said. "You are passionate. I admire that. But you should understand that this kind of project is going to happen in this valley, Miss Reardon, with you or without you. I am offering you the chance to be on the inside of it. People who refuse the inside often find themselves on the outside, and the outside can be a difficult place. I will give you 30 days to reconsider. After that, we will need to find another way." He turned and walked back to his Cadillac. He turned the car around with 3 careful maneuvers on the narrow rail bed. He drove away. The sound of his suspension complaining about the stones receded into the trees and was gone. Neve stood on the platform for a long time afterward with Conrad's circular saw at her feet and the late July afternoon sun on her shoulders. The Hamilton on the agent's desk inside the booth ticked steadily. She could hear it through the open door, the faint, patient sound that Ezekiel Pritchard had heard for 26 years. She went back to repairing the platform decking. The work was the work, and it did not change because of a Cadillac. The pressure began the following week. It began quietly the way these things always begin. The lumber yard in Bedford that had been selling her cedar shingles called to say that they could no longer fill her order due to inventory issues. When she called the second lumber yard in Altoona, the manager was polite, but also could not help her. The hardware store where she had been buying nails and roofing tar told her on her next visit that the prices had been adjusted. They were now 4 times what she had been paying. The owner did not look her in the eye when he said it. A man came out one afternoon in a county truck with a clipboard and said he was from the township assessor's office. He had been instructed to reassess the property. The depot, which had been taxed at $0 for 58 years because it had been a derelict building scheduled for demolition, was now to be taxed as a residential structure with substantial improvements. The new annual assessment was $2,100. He left the paperwork on the bench and drove away. Margaret looked at the assessment when she came on Wednesday. She read it carefully and then folded it and put it in her coat pocket. "This is not how the township assesses a property like this," she said. "I have worked in that office for 19 years. I know how it is done. Someone called the county and asked them to do this." She paused. "I will see what I can find out. Do not pay this until I tell you to pay it." Neve nodded. That night, the rock came through the bay window. She was asleep on the iron cot in the freight room when she heard the sound of breaking glass, and she was on her feet before she had decided to be on her feet. The depot was dark. She felt her way to the waiting room and lit the kerosene lamp on the bench, and the light showed her the rock lying in the middle of the slate floor of the ticket booth and the broken middle sash of the bay window above the agent's desk. The rock was the size of her fist. There was no note tied to it. There did not need to be. She did not cry. She swept up the glass with the broom she kept in the freight room. She set the rock on the agent's desk beside the Hamilton because it seemed important to her to keep it as evidence of what had happened, and she went back to bed and did not sleep again until the sky began to turn gray over the eastern ridge. She drove into the village the next morning with Margaret, who had come out at 7 o'clock when Neve had walked the 4 miles to call her from the township office's phone. The county sheriff's deputy who took the report was a courteous young man who wrote everything down carefully and who said all the things he was supposed to say and who clearly had no intention of doing anything about it. Margaret drove Neve back to the depot in silence. When they reached the clearing, Margaret shut off the engine and sat with her hands on the steering wheel for a long moment. "Sterling Hospitality Group has friends in the county," she said. "I know who some of them are. I will see what I can do. But I want you to understand something, Neve. This is going to get worse before it gets better. They will not stop with the rock. You need to decide now whether you can bear what is coming." Neve looked at the depot. The bay window's broken middle sash was a black gap in the morning sun. "I can bear it," she said. "I have nowhere else to go, Mrs. Bachman. This is where I am." Margaret nodded. She started the truck. She drove away. Neve reglazed the bay window herself the following weekend. Conrad came to help, and he did not say a word about the rock or about Sterling, but his face when he saw the broken sash was the face of a man who was beginning to consider some things he had not considered in a long time. He brought the linseed putty and the small finishing brads and the careful patience he had been bringing all summer, And they set the new pane together, and when they were finished, Conrad looked at the window for a long time. "That is a good window now," he said. And then he said something else very quietly, almost to himself. "It will take more than rocks to break this place." Bartholomew Sterling came back on the 7th of August. He came alone this time, again in the silver Cadillac, and he carried a leather portfolio under his arm. He found Neve on the platform laying down a coat of linseed oil on the new white oak bench that Conrad had built her the previous week. She did not stand up when he stopped at the edge of the platform. She continued to brush the oil into the wood slowly and evenly, the way Conrad had taught her. "Miss Reardon," Sterling said, "I had hoped you would have reconsidered by now." "I have not, Mr. Sterling." He nodded. He opened the leather portfolio. He withdrew a sheaf of papers. "Then I am afraid I must inform you of a development. My attorneys have been doing some research on the chain of title for this property and on the disposition of the personal effects of the previous occupant, Mr. Ezekiel Pritchard. I have learned that I am in fact a descendant of Mr. Pritchard's wife, Eleanor Sterling, Pritchard through her younger brother, Cornelius Sterling, my great-great-grandfather. Mr. Pritchard died intestate in 1962 in the Bedford County home with no surviving direct heirs. Under Pennsylvania law, his personal property passed by intestate succession to the descendants of his wife's family. My attorneys advised me that any chattels found on the premises that had belonged to Mr. Pritchard, including the lockbox that I understand you discovered beneath the floor, are properly mine. I am suing for their recovery." He extended the papers toward her. Neve did not take them. She set the brush down on the lid of the linseed can. She stood up. She looked at Bartholomew Sterling for a long, careful moment. "You may set those on the bench, Mr. Sterling." He set them on the bench. He smiled. The smile had no warmth in it now, only the cold geometric satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally found the right tool for the job. "I do not have to do this, Miss Reardon. The lawsuit will take 8 or 9 months. It will be expensive for both of us. I am still prepared to make my offer, $80,000. The lawsuit goes away. You walk away with more money than you have ever seen. You can use it to start a new life somewhere else. I will even help you find a place. I have contacts." Nave said, "Mr. Sterling, I would like you to leave my property." He smiled again. "It may not be your property much longer, Miss Reardon." He turned and walked to his Cadillac and drove away. She read the papers that night, sitting at the agent's desk in the ticket booth, with the kerosene lamp burning and the Hamilton ticking patiently beside her. The lawsuit was real. The claim was at least colorably plausible. She did not understand all of the legal language, but she understood enough of it to know that this was not a thing she could fight with cedar shingles and linseed oil. She drove into Bedford the next day and used the public library's computer to look for a lawyer. She found a young attorney named Daniel Raskovic, who had grown up in Penn Forest Township and had returned 3 years ago to open a small practice in Bedford because he had said he wanted to do real work for real people instead of the bond work he had been doing in Philadelphia. He agreed to meet her for coffee at the diner across the street. He read the papers. He took notes. He told her honestly that the case was not a slam dunk for either side, that it would depend on documentary evidence and on the credibility of the testimony, and that it would cost her approximately $18,000 to litigate even if they won. He offered to take it on a reduced rate because he had read about the depot in the township newsletter, and he had spent his boyhood walking the old railbed, and he said that some things deserve real work for less money. Neve thanked him. She told him she would think about it. She drove back to the depot. She did not have $18,000. She had Ezekiel's $9,320 in the credit union and approximately $900 she had saved from the diner in Scranton, and the 11 silver dollars, and that was the whole of her resources in the world. If she paid Daniel, she would have nothing left for the winter, and the winter was coming. The autumn came down quickly that year. The leaves turned in the third week of September. The maples first, then the oaks and the hickories, and by the second week of October, the ridges around Slate Brook Junction were the deep colors of a Pennsylvania autumn that has decided it is in no particular hurry to end. Neve kept working. She finished tuck-pointing the chimney before the first hard frost. She cut and split 3 cords of firewood with Conrad in the woods behind the depot, the two of them working slowly through long afternoons in the falling leaves, Conrad teaching her how to read the grain of a piece of oak so that the splitting maul would find the seam without being told. She stockpiled the wood under the eaves. She cleaned and oiled all of her tools. She wrote letters to Stefania every Sunday and mailed them from the post office in the village. In the evenings, she sat by the pot-bellied stove in the waiting room with one of Wendell's old PR timetables open in her lap, reading the schedules for the Bedford branch as they had been printed in 1953 and 1954, the years her grandfather had ridden the line. She traced the freight movements with her finger. She matched the southbound through freights to the dates her grandfather had been at the depot for coffee. She built a small picture in her head of the time he had spent here, the way a person builds a map of a place by walking the ground. The lawsuit moved slowly the way lawsuits move. Daniel sent her copies of the filings. He warned her that Sterling's attorneys were going to take their time. She did not respond. She did not have $18,000 to give him. She had decided sometime in late September that she was going to lose a lawsuit if it came to a courtroom. The realization did not paralyze her. It only sharpened her work. The depot was hers under the deed regardless of the lockbox. The lockbox was a thing she had been given. Ezekiel had wanted her to have it. If a court took it from her, it would still have been hers for the months she had carried it, and she would have learned to shingle a roof on Ezekiel's money, and the depot would still stand at the end of the rail bed, and that would have been worth something, even if she had nothing in the lockbox at the end. She did not know yet what she did not know. The first heavy snow fell on the 11th of November. By the 1st of December, there were 8 inches on the ground. By Christmas, the woods around Slate Brook Junction were a still white country, the rail bed a faint depression under the snow, the trees laced with rime. Neve kept the pot-bellied stove burning day and night, and the 3 cords of firewood that Conrad had helped her cut and stack in the autumn began to dwindle a little faster than she had planned for, and she rationed the coffee carefully because the county shuttle had stopped running for the season and resupply was hard. The storm came on the night of the 17th of January. It came up from the south, an unusual track for a Pennsylvania storm, and it carried with it heavy wet snow that piled up at almost 6 inches an hour for 9 straight hours. Neve sat by the stove all night and listened to it. The trees in the clearing began to crack and groan under the weight. Toward 4 in the morning, she heard a different sound. A long, grinding rip followed by a heavy tumbling crash from the direction of the freight room. She did not have to go look to know what had happened. The new roof over the freight room, the roof she had rebuilt with her own hands over 4 months, had partially given way under the weight of the snow. She went and looked anyway, holding the kerosene lamp. The eastern third of the freight room roof had collapsed inward. The cot was buried under a tangle of broken rafters and snow, and the cedar shingles she had laid so carefully in May. Her wool blanket was somewhere underneath it. The framed photograph of her father had been on the shelf above the cot. The shelf was gone. She stood in the doorway with the lamp held up, and she looked at the wreckage of 4 months of her own work, and she thought about Bartholomew Sterling in his charcoal suit, and the $18,000 she did not have for the lawyer, and the long winter that was only halfway over, and her mother in the row house in Scranton with the man who had taped a note to a door. And Neve Reardon, who had not cried since the night of the cardboard box on the front porch 11 months earlier, sat down in the snow on the slate floor of the freight room doorway with a kerosene lamp in her lap, and she cried. She cried for a long time. The lamp burned down low while she cried. The wind came in through the broken roof and blew snow across her face, and she did not move. When she finally stopped crying, the eastern sky was beginning to turn the cold gray of January dawn, and she was so cold that her hands no longer felt like her own. She got up. She blew out the lamp. She went into the waiting room and sat in front of the pot-bellied stove and put her hands on the warm iron and thought about what came next. She did not know what came next. She remembered then that she had not finished going through the agent's desk in the ticket booth. The desk had a row of small drawers along the front, and she had emptied most of them in March, but there was a deeper drawer at the bottom right that she had not been able to open because the wood had swelled and the drawer was stuck. She had put off dealing with it. She had put off a lot of things in the way that people put off small things when the large things are demanding all of their attention. She went into the ticket booth and lit a candle stub on the desk. She wedged the blade of her pocket knife into the seam of the stuck drawer and worked it carefully. The drawer eased open with a soft scrape. Inside the drawer was a single object, a leather-bound notebook, the leather worn soft and dark with use, the brass clasp tarnished but still functional. She lifted it out. She set it on the desk. She unfastened the clasp. The first page bore a careful, slanted handwriting she had come to know almost as well as her grandfather's. Personal Journal of Ezekiel Pritchard's Station, Agent Slatebrook, Junction. Begun April 1st, 1932. She turned the pages slowly. Most of them were the small daily notations of a man who had kept a station agent's habits of mind. The weather, the trains, the passengers, the names of brakemen and conductors, the price of coal, the quality of the coffee. She turned through the spring of 1932 and the summer and the autumn. She turned into 1933, and on the page dated November 14th, 1933, she found this. Today, the Allegheny Bedford Savings Trust closed its doors. The notice was nailed to the front entrance at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I learned of it from the Wednesday southbound. Half the township is ruined. The Hartmans lost everything. Old Mr. Schaefer lost everything. Eleanor's brother lost his children's college money. I have lost 11 years of my own savings. There is talk that the Sterling family, who has owned the bank since the 1890s, withdrew the entire principal of their personal accounts on Friday, 3 days before the bank closed. It is said that Cornelius Sterling drove down to Pittsburgh on Friday morning with 2 suitcases of cash. I cannot prove any of this, but the men who say it are not men who lie, and the timing is what it is. The Sterlings will not be ruined. They will be the only family in Bedford County that is not ruined. Eleanor cried tonight. She said her brother is a good man and does not deserve this. I held her, and I did not say what I was thinking, which was that the Sterlings will land on their feet because the Sterlings always land on their feet, and the rest of us will have to make our own coffee from now on. Neve read the entry 3 times. The candle burned lower. She read forward through the journal, scanning quickly, now looking for the name. She found it again on a page dated January 9th, 1934. Cornelius Sterling has bought the Schaefer farm at the foreclosure auction. He paid less than 1/10 of its value. Eleanor will not speak to her brother. And again on March 22nd, 1934, Leonor's brother came to the depot today and asked her to forgive him. She told him she could not. He left. And one final time on a page dated June 17th, 1958, which was the same day Ezekiel had written the letter that Neve had read in February. The branch closes Friday. I have left the lockbox in its place. I have hidden this journal in the bottom drawer where I do not think anyone will look. I want what I have written here to be known by someone someday. The Sterlings stole from this valley in 1933. They have prospered ever since. I do not believe they have ever been called to account. No, perhaps someday someone will read this and understand. Neve closed the journal. She held it in both hands. The candle had nearly guttered. The first gray light of dawn was beginning to come through the bay window above her, the new bay window she had reglazed in July, and the cold January morning was perfectly silent, except for the sound of the Hamilton ticking on the desk beside the journal. Bartholomew Sterling was the great-great-great-grandson of Cornelius Sterling. The man who was now suing her for Ezekiel Pritchard's lockbox was the descendant of the man who had ruined Ezekiel Pritchard 93 years ago. The lockbox had not been Ezekiel's life savings because he had been a thrifty man. It had been his life savings because the Sterlings had stolen everything he had once trusted to the bank, and after that he had never trusted a bank again, and he had hidden his money under the floor of the ticket booth for 26 years because of what the Sterlings had done. And now the Sterlings had come back to take the rest. She sat at the agent's desk for a long time. The candle went out. The dawn came up through the bay window, and the snow on the rail bed was the cold blue color that snow becomes in the first light. Inside the depot, the freight room roof was still collapsed, and the photograph of her father was still buried in the wreckage, and the cold air still moved through the building from the broken place. But Neve Reardon was no longer crying. The journal was on the desk in front of her. The Hamilton was beside it, ticking the time of a railroad that had closed 68 years ago. Her grandfather's silver pocket watch was around her neck on its leather cord. She put her hand on the journal. "Mr. Pritchard," she said aloud in the empty depot in the cold January morning, "I think I understand now. I think I see what you wanted me to do." She read every word of Ezekiel Pritchard's journal in the 3 days that followed. She read it slowly and carefully the way her grandfather had taught her to read anything that mattered, and she made notes in her own pocket notebook in pencil, and she did not stop reading until she had reached the final page dated June 17th, 1958. What she found in those pages was not a single piece of damning evidence. Bartholomew Sterling's lawyers would not be undone by a single damning entry, and Neve, who had spent her childhood listening to her grandfather Declan explain that steel does not lie and gravity does not lie, understood that what she had instead was something more useful than a single piece of evidence. She had a pattern. She had a record kept in real time over 26 years by a man who had been there, who had watched the Sterling family's careful management of Bedford County from the inside, and who had recorded it in the small, careful sentences of a man who was not trying to be a witness because he did not yet know that anyone would ever read what he was writing. The Allegheny Bedford Savings Trust had closed on November 14th, 1933. Ezekiel had named over the course of the winter and spring of 1934 47 separate Bedford County families who had lost their savings: the Hartmans, the Schaefers, the Penroses, the Vogels, the Ashworths, the Riordans. Neve had stopped breathing when she had come to the Riordans, and she had read the entry 3 times before she had been able to continue. Patrick Riordan came up on the southbound this afternoon. He was crying when he got off the train. He had brought his savings to the bank on the Wednesday, the day before the closure. He has lost $1,200. He has 6 children, the youngest only 2. Eleanor gave him a cup of coffee, and then she gave him another. He sat on the bench for 2 hours before he could stand up to walk home. Patrick Reardon was Neve's great-grandfather. He had walked 4 miles back to his coal patch house in the November cold of 1933 with $1,200 stolen from him by Cornelia Sterling, and he had told his wife and his 6 children that there was no money for Christmas and no money for the doctor and no money for the rent. The 2-year-old in the journal entry was the boy Eamon, whose name Nav had heard her grandfather speak only once at her father's funeral. That was my brother Declan had said quietly, kneeling at the casket. Eamon went on the section gang at 16 so I could finish ninth grade. He died in 1972. I have outlived everyone, Cillian. I am sorry. Niev had been 12. She had not understood. She understood now. Patrick Riordan had a youngest son born the following year who would be Neve's grandfather Declan. Patrick was 33 when Declan was born in 1934. Declan would quit school at 15 because his father had died of black lung in 1949, and the family had needed the wages, because the Sterlings had taken the savings that should have lasted them through any sickness 16 years before. The journal was not just Ezekiel Pritchard's record. The journal was the record of Neve's own family. The Sterlings had stolen from the Riordans 93 years before Bartholomew Sterling had walked across her platform with his charcoal suit and his offer of $80,000. The depot had been waiting for her since June 17, 1958, and she had not understood the full weight of the waiting until she had read the entry of November 16, 1933, on the third evening of her reading, sitting at the agent's desk with the Hamilton ticking beside her and the sky above the broken freight room growing dim with new snow. She closed the journal. She put both hands flat on the leather cover. She said aloud to the empty depot and to the man who had once sat on her stool, "I am going to do this for you, Mr. Pritchard, and I am going to do it for my great-grandfather, and I am going to do it for the Hartmans and the Schaefers and the Penroses and the rest of them." The Hamilton ticked. The fire popped softly in the pot-bellied stove. The depot was warm and tight against the January cold. The men of Penn Forest Township came on the morning of the 19th. Neve did not know how the news had reached them. She would learn later that Margaret Bachman had walked the 4 miles from the village on snowshoes the day after the storm, that she had seen the collapsed freight room roof, that she had walked back without saying anything, and had spent the rest of that afternoon at her telephone. Margaret had called Conrad Vogler. Conrad had called Wendell Ashworth. Wendell had called the 7 retired Conrail and PRR men he had known for 60 years. They arrived at Slate Brook Junction at 8 in the morning on the 19th, all in their own pickup trucks with their own tools, and they said almost nothing to each other but simply looked at the collapsed roof and nodded. One of them, an 81-year-old retired track foreman named Ellsworth Penrose, who walked with a pronounced limp from a coupling injury he had taken in 1968, and who had not done framing work in 15 years, said only the 4 words, "We start at 9." They had the new framing up by sundown on the 19th. They had the new sheathing on by sundown on the 20th. They had the new shingles laid by sundown on the 21st. They worked in a careful relay through the cold, taking turns at the bottom of the ladder, breaking for coffee in the waiting room every 2 hours, eating sandwiches Margaret and her sister-in-law brought down from the village. Stefania Novak closed the diner in Scranton on the evening of the 18th and drove 4 hours through the snow with her car loaded with food and blankets and a cast-iron pot of cabbage soup. She arrived at the depot at midnight. She slept on the folding cot Conrad had set up in the waiting room. She cooked 3 meals a day for 12 men and 1 young woman across 3 days. She did not let Neve into the kitchen except to wash dishes. On the evening of the 21st, with the new freight room roof tight against the sky, Conrad cooked a Dutch oven stew over the pot-bellied stove. The 8 men and Stefania and Margaret and Neve ate together at a long plank table in the waiting room. The talk was the talk of men who had been doing useful work all day. Wendell told a story about a freight conductor named Mickey Connolly who had been deaf in one ear for 40 years and had refused to admit it. Conrad told a story about a barn raising in 1979 where a young man had nailed his hand to a rafter and had not noticed for 10 minutes. Ellsworth Penrose, who had not spoken much during the work, told a story about his grandfather, who had been a section foreman on the Pennsylvania for 37 years and who had once held up a freight train for 40 minutes by walking out into the right-of-way with a red lantern because he had calculated that the train was carrying a defective journal box and he had not been wrong. Neve listened. She did not say much. She sat at the end of the table with the journal open at her elbow because she had not been able to bear to leave it in the desk while these men were under her roof. When the supper was finished and the dishes were washed and the men had begun to put on their coats to go home, Neve stood up. She held the journal in her hands. She looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Bachman," she said, "I would like to ask you for something." Margaret looked at her steadily. "Go on." "I would like you to call a town meeting." There was a silence at the long plank table. The men had stopped putting on their coats. Conrad set his cap back on the table. Wendell turned in his chair to look at her. Ellsworth Penrose, who was already in his coat and standing by the stove, set his hand on the warm iron and waited. Neve said, "I have been reading Mr. Pritchard's journal. He kept it from 1932 to 1958. I believe what I have read in it is something that the township ought to know. I do not want to argue this in court. I want to read it out loud to the people whose families are named in it. I want them to know what their grandfathers and great-grandfathers lost, and I want them to know who took it. I am not asking the township to do anything. I am only asking the township to hear it." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then Margaret nodded once. "I will call the meeting," she said. "I will call it for Saturday, February the 7th. I will put a notice in the township newsletter, and I will post it on the bulletin board outside the post office, and I will telephone every household in the township personally. That is 43 telephone calls. I will make them tomorrow." "Thank you, Mrs. Bachman." Margaret stood up. She put on her coat. She paused with her hand on the door. "Neve," she said, "I want you to understand something. The Sterling family has not been forgotten in Penn Forest Township. My own grandmother lost $360 in 1933. My grandfather had been saving it to buy a second team of horses. He never bought the horses. He worked his own land with one team for the rest of his life because of what was taken from him. We have all known. We have not had the proof. You have given us the proof. I will make the calls." She opened the door. She walked out into the cold. The men finished putting on their coats. Ellsworth Penrose was the last to leave. He stopped beside Neve's chair and looked at the journal on the table. "My grandfather's name in there," he said. "Yes, sir. The Penrose family lost $640 in November of 1933. Mr. Pritchard wrote it down. I will read it on Saturday." Ellsworth Penrose nodded. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Reardon, I am 81 years old. I have been waiting to hear that read out loud since I was old enough to understand what my grandfather lost. I will be there on Saturday." He turned, he walked out. Stefania stayed for 10 days after the roof was finished. She slept in the freight room on the cot Conrad had built, and she cooked 3 meals a day for whoever was working at the depot, And on the morning of her departure, she stood beside her car in the clearing and looked at Neve for a long moment and said, "You are the daughter I never had, Reardon girl. I am too old to say it any other way." She drove back to Scranton. Neve stood in the clearing for a long time afterward. She had not been able to think of any words large enough to hold what she had been given. The week between Margaret's announcement and the meeting was the longest week of Neve's life. She did not sleep well. She rehearsed what she would say at the meeting, and then she stopped rehearsing because she understood that she was not the one who needed to do the speaking. The journal was the one that needed to do the speaking. Her job was simply to read it clearly and to let the words of a man who had been dead for 63 years carry the weight that they had been keeping for that long. Conrad came every afternoon that week to help her finish the small repairs on the freight room. Wendell came on Sunday afternoon and brought her a folder of additional documents from the Conrail archives in Altoona, including a copy of the original 1932 commemorative photograph from the day the Slatebrook Junction Depot had been opened. Neve had not seen the photograph before. Wendell laid it on the agent's desk. "I found it in a box of records they were going to throw out last year," he said. "I asked if I could keep it. They said yes. I did not think I would have a use for it. I think I have a use for it now." The photograph was 8 by 10 inches black and white faded to sepia along the edges. It showed the depot on the day of its opening, June 14th, 1932. 3 men stood on the platform in dark suits and bowler hats. A small crowd of perhaps 40 people stood on the rail bed. Neve recognized the bay window above the platform. She recognized the freight room door. She recognized the round metal sign that now hung above the bay again. Wendell put his finger on one of the 3 men in dark suits. "That is Ezekiel Pritchard. He was 38 years old. He had just been appointed station agent." He moved his finger to a man standing in the front row of the crowd. The man was thin and dark-haired, perhaps 30 years old, and he was wearing the rough wool coat of a coal patch laborer, and he was holding the hand of a small boy of perhaps 3. "And this," Wendell said, "is Patrick Riordan, your great-grandfather. The little boy is Eamon, his oldest son. Your grandfather Declan was not born yet. He came along in 34 a year and a half after this picture was taken. The toddler in this picture is your great-uncle. Eamon Riordan went on the section gang at 16. He worked the Bedford branch from 1949 to 1954, the same years your grandfather Declan was on temporary assignment from the Pocono Division. 2 Riordan brothers on this branch at the same time. Their father had just died of black lung. They were sending money home to their mother and the 4 sisters between them." Neve sat down on the wooden stool. She put both hands on the agent's desk. She did not say anything for a long time. Wendell did not say anything either. The Hamilton ticked. The new fire in the stove popped softly. "Mr. Ashworth," Neve said finally, "may I take this photograph to the meeting?" "You may, Miss Riordan. That is why I brought it." The meeting was held in the Penn Forest Township Hall on Saturday, February 7th, 2027. The Township Hall was a plain frame building with white clapboard siding and a peaked tin roof set across the main street from the post office, and it had been used for town meetings since 1881. The hall held perhaps 120 people if the folding chairs were set up tightly. On the evening of the 7th, the hall held 147 people, with another 23 standing at the back along the wall, and the temperature inside the hall rose during the meeting from the cold of the February evening to the warm closeness of a room full of people who had come for a particular reason and who were not going to leave until they had seen it through. Margaret called the meeting to order at 7 o'clock. She stood at the front of the hall in her good wool coat with the journal on the small wooden lectern in front of her, and she explained in her careful, clean sentences that Neve Reardon had purchased the Slatebrook Junction Depot at the surplus auction the previous February for the sum of $10, and that Neve had restored the depot through her own labor over the course of the year, and that a private development corporation called Sterling Hospitality Group of Pittsburgh had filed a civil suit against Neve in Bedford County Court on the 7th of August of the previous year, claiming title to certain personal property recovered from beneath the floor of the depot. Margaret said that the matter had a longer history than the lawsuit, and that the longer history had been brought to her attention by Miss Reardon 2 weeks earlier, and that she had asked Miss Reardon to share that history with the township this evening. She turned and looked at Neve. Neve stood up from the chair at the front of the hall. Neve was wearing her work clothes because she did not own dress clothes, and she had her grandfather's silver pocket watch around her neck on its leather cord, and she had Ezekiel's Hamilton 992B in the breast pocket of her flannel shirt. She walked to the lectern. She set the photograph on it beside the journal. She looked out at the hall. She saw Conrad Vogler in the second row. She saw Wendell Ashworth beside him. She saw Margaret's husband Werner and 3 other men she had come to recognize from her trips into the village. She saw Stefania Novak, who had driven down from Scranton that morning and was sitting in the third row with her hands folded carefully in her lap. She saw Daniel Raskovic, the young attorney, standing along the back wall. She saw Bartholomew Sterling and 2 of his lawyers in the front row on the right. Sterling was wearing a different charcoal suit. He was smiling the small, confident smile of a man who had decided in advance that no town meeting in a building like this could threaten him. Neve opened the journal to the page she had marked with a strip of red ribbon. She began to read. She read the entry for November 14th, 1933. Her voice was clear and even, the careful slanted voice of a person who had been raised by a man who had believed that work spoke for itself if you let it. The Allegheny Bedford Savings Trust closed its doors today. The notice was nailed to the front entrance at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Half the township is ruined. The Hartmans lost everything. Old Mr. Schaefer lost everything. Eleanor's brother lost his children's college money. I have lost 11 years of my own savings. There is talk that the Sterling family, who has owned the bank since the 1890s, withdrew the entire principal of their personal accounts on Friday, 3 days before the bank closed. There was a small movement in the hall. A woman in the fourth row pressed her hand to her mouth. Neve continued reading. She read the entry for November 16th, 1933, with the names of the 47 families. She read each name slowly. She read the entry for the Riordans. She read it without changing her voice. She read the entry for the Vogels, and Conrad Vogler, in the second row, closed his eyes for a long moment. She read the entry for the Bachmans, and Margaret beside her did not move. She read the entry for the Penroses, and a thin old man in the back of the hall who was 81 years old and had ridden over to the meeting in his pickup truck, stood up suddenly and walked out of the hall because Ellsworth Penrose did not want anyone in the room to see what was happening to his face. He came back in 20 minutes later. By then, Neve was reading the entry for January 9th, 1934, about Cornelius Sterling buying the Schaefer farm at the foreclosure auction for less than 1/10 of its value. She read for 45 minutes. She read every entry that mentioned the bank and the families and the Sterlings from November of 1933 through the spring of 1936. When she had finished, she closed the journal carefully. She set her hand on the cover. "This is the journal of Ezekiel Pritchard," she said. "He was the station agent at Slatebrook Junction from 1932 until 1958. He kept this journal for 26 years. He hid it in the bottom drawer of his desk on his last day at the depot, which was June 17th, 1958. He hid it because he believed that someone someday would read what he had written and would understand. I found it on the morning of the 18th of January after the freight room roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow. I have read every word of it. The entries I have read aloud tonight are only some of what is in here. There are more. She paused. She lifted the photograph. This was taken on the day Slate Brook Junction opened, June 14th, 1932. The man on the platform is Ezekiel Pritchard. The man in the front of the crowd holding the hand of his small son is Patrick Riordan. He was my great-grandfather. The Riordans were one of the 47 families. We lost $1,200. My great-grandfather walked 4 miles back to his house in November of 1933, and he told his 6 children there would be no Christmas. He died of black lung in 1949. His youngest son, my grandfather Declan, quit school at 15 because the family needed the wages. The family needed the wages because of what had been taken from them in 1933. My grandfather worked the Bedford branch in 1953 and 1954 alongside his older brother Eamon, who is the toddler in this picture. Two of Patrick Riordan's sons working on the same branch line, sending money home to a mother who had been left destitute by the failure of a bank that had been deliberately emptied by the family that owned it. She looked out at the hall. She looked at Bartholomew Sterling in the front row. He was no longer smiling. Mr. Sterling has filed suit against me for the personal property of Mr. Pritchard on the basis of his descent from Cornelius Sterling, who was Eleanor Pritchard's brother. I will not contest his descent. He may be a descendant. I do not know. What I do know, because Mr. Pritchard recorded it, is that Cornelius Sterling drove down to Pittsburgh on the Friday morning before the bank closed with 2 suitcases of cash. I know that the Sterling family bought the Schaefer farm and the Hartman Mill and 17 other foreclosed properties in Bedford County in the year that followed at less than a tenth of value with the cash they had withdrawn from the bank before they closed it. I know this because Ezekiel Pritchard wrote it down while it was happening. I have given a copy of this journal to Mrs. Bachman's office. The original is here on this lectern. The history is here. The names are here. The dates are here. She closed the journal. She set both hands on it. I am not asking the township to do anything tonight. I am only asking you to know what I now know. I am asking you to know what Mr. Pritchard wanted you to know when he hid this journal in the desk in 1958. After tonight, the journal goes to the township archive where it will remain available to anyone who wants to read it. It will be read. The families whose names are in it will read it, and the lawsuit against me will be heard by a Bedford County jury that may include some of the descendants of the families whose savings were taken in 1933. I am content to let that jury decide. She stepped back from the lectern. She returned to her chair. The hall was silent for perhaps 4 full seconds. Then Ellsworth Penrose, the 81-year-old retired track foreman, who had come back inside 20 minutes earlier, stood up from his folding chair in the back of the hall. He was a tall, thin man with white hair and a long face, and he had not spoken at a town meeting in 14 years. He walked slowly down the center aisle holding his cap in his hand until he was standing beside Neve's chair. He turned to face the hall. My grandfather lost $640 in that bank in 1933, he said. His voice was cracked but firm. He was a section foreman on the Pennsylvania for 37 years. He had saved that money 1 paycheck at a time for 14 years. He was going to use it to send my father to a teaching college. My father did not go to a teaching college. My father went on the section gang at the age of 16. I went on the section gang at the age of 17. We have all of us been section men in this family because of what was taken in 1933. I have not heard the Penrose name read from a record like that in my life. Miss Reardon has just read it. I am 81 years old and I have waited 93 years to hear it read out loud. I want it understood by everyone in this room that the Penrose family stands with Miss Reardon. He sat down. There was another silence. Then Conrad Vogler stood up. The Vogel name was read tonight, he said. My grandmother was a Vogel before she was married. They lost $290. The Vogler family stands with Miss Reardon. Werner Bachmann stood up. My wife's family lost the price of a team of horses in 1933. The Bachmann family stands with Miss Reardon. A woman Neve did not know in the fourth row stood up. The Hartmans stand with Miss Reardon. A man in the sixth row stood up. The Schaefer family stands with Miss Reardon. It went on like that. It went on for a long time. By the time it was finished, more than 60 people in the hall had stood up and named their families and their losses, and the hall was warm and close and silent in the way that rooms become silent when something old and heavy has finally been lifted out of them and set down where it can be seen. Bartholomew Sterling and his two attorneys had left somewhere in the middle of it. Neve had not seen them leave. Margaret told her later that they had walked out during the testimony of the Hartman descendant and that no one had spoken to them as they had passed through the hall and that the silver Cadillac had not come back. The lawsuit was withdrawn the following Tuesday morning. The papers were filed at the Bedford County Courthouse by a different attorney than the two who had attended the meeting. Neve was not present for the filing, and she did not learn of it until Daniel Raskovich called her at the township office on Wednesday afternoon. The lawsuit was over. There was no settlement. There was no admission. There was simply the withdrawal in the small, clean language of the courts with no further proceedings contemplated. Daniel asked her if she wanted to file for sanctions or for fees. She told him she did not. She told him she had what she had wanted. The depot had been quiet for the long winter. The shingles were tight. The bay window held. The freight room roof, rebuilt in 3 days by the 8 men who had come on the 19th of January, was the strongest part of the building. The spring came slowly. The snow melted off the railbed in the third week of March, and the railbed reappeared as a long, straight depression running between the bare trees and the moss on the platform. Boards greened up overnight, and the first hikers of the season began to come down the right-of-way. By April, the kettle was hot on the pot-bellied stove every day. By May, Nav had set up a small free coffee station on the platform with a sign Conrad had carved that read, Slatebrook Junction Coffee, no charge tip jar if you like. People left things in the tip jar. They also left honey and bread and wildflowers and small notes. And once on a Saturday afternoon in early May, a hand-lettered card from a woman who had walked the railbed alone after her husband's funeral, thanking Neve for the warm waiting room and the cup of coffee and the bench where she had sat for 2 hours and had not been asked anything. It was a Wednesday afternoon in the third week of March to snow off the railbed and the first warm day of the year when Neve looked up from sweeping the platform and saw a woman walking down the railbed from the direction of the trailhead. The woman was thin. She was wearing a wool coat that had not been new in some time. She was 48 years old, but the gray that had come into her hair in the last year and the lines around her mouth that had not been there before made her look closer to 55. She walked slowly. She was carrying a small canvas overnight bag. When she reached the edge of the platform, she stopped and set the bag down on the railbed, and she looked at the depot for a long moment, and then she looked at Neve. It was Maura Brady, Neve's mother. Neve did not move. She had not seen her mother in 13 months. Her mother's hair had been brown the last time. Her mother had not had the lines around her mouth the last time. Her mother had been pretty in the careful way that women are pretty when they have given up trying to be anything more than careful, and now she was something else. Now she was a thin, older-looking woman with gray hair and a wool coat that did not quite fit standing on a railbed 4 miles from the nearest county road. Neve, her mother said. The voice was the same. The voice had not changed. Neve set the broom down. She walked to the edge of the platform. She did not step down onto the railbed. Mother, her mother looked at her. She did not move toward the platform. She seemed to understand in the way that mothers sometimes understand that the distance between the railbed and the platform was the distance she had created, and that she was not the one who could close it. I am not asking for anything, her mother said. I want you to know that first. I did not come here to ask for anything. Then why did you come? Because Roland left in July. Neve did not say anything. Her mother continued. He left with most of the savings. I do not know where he is. He took the car and the bank account and the small certificates of deposit your father had set up for me. The house is going to foreclosure in May. I have been working at a laundromat in Wilkes-Barre for 6 months. I am living in a room above a hardware store. I did not come here to ask you for anything, Nev. I want you to understand that. I came because I wanted to tell you something, and I could not write it in a letter. She paused. She looked down at the railbed. She looked back up. I knew the night I taped the note to the door. I knew the moment I heard the porch step under your foot. I knew when I heard you try the latch. I knew when I heard you walk away. Roland had told me he would leave if I did not do it, and I had been alone for 2 years before I met him, and I could not bear to be alone again. I chose him. I chose him over you. I have known every day for 13 months that I made the wrong choice. I knew it the night I made it. I knew it before I made it. I made it anyway. Her mother stopped. She did not cry. She did not seem to be able to cry anymore, which was perhaps a worse thing than crying. I am not asking you to forgive me, Neve. I do not think you should. I am asking you to know that I knew. I knew what I was doing. I knew what I was losing. I lost it on purpose. She picked up the canvas bag. I'm going to walk back to the trailhead. I have a bus to Wilkes-Barre at 6 o'clock. I wanted to see the depot. I wanted to see what you had built. I wanted to tell you what I told you. That is all I came for. She turned. She began to walk back along the railbed. Neve stood on the platform. The Hamilton was in her shirt pocket. The silver pocket watch was around her neck. The depot was warm at her back. The kettle on the stove was beginning to sing, and the sound of it reached her through the open waiting room door. Her mother had walked perhaps 30 feet down the railbed when Neve said, "Wait." Her mother stopped. She did not turn around. Nav said, "There is coffee on the stove. I have a bench in the waiting room. You may have a cup before you walk back." Her mother stood very still. After a long moment, she turned. She walked back to the platform. She did not look at Neve's face. She walked up the platform steps and into the waiting room. Neve followed her in. She poured a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. She handed it to her mother. They did not speak. Her mother sat on the long wooden bench. Neve sat at the agent's desk in the open ticket booth 6 feet away, where she could see her mother through the open door. They sat that way for an hour. The coffee was finished. The kettle stopped singing. The afternoon light moved across the slate floor. Her mother set the empty cup on the bench beside her. "Thank you," her mother said. "I will go back now. There is a bus stop at the trailhead. The 4:30 shuttle goes to Bedford. From Bedford, you can connect to Wilkes-Barre." "Yes, I know. I came that way." Her mother stood up. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the door frame. She did not turn around. "Neve," she said, "I do not know if you will ever want to see me again. I will not come back unless you ask me to, but if you ever do ask me, I will come." She walked out. She walked down the platform steps. She walked along the railbed toward the trailhead. Neve sat at the agent's desk and watched her go until the gray wool coat was a small, distant figure against the dark trees, and then she could not see her at all. Neve did not cry. She had cried on the floor of the freight room doorway in January, more than she had thought she had in her, and she had decided sometime during that long crying that she would not cry again for things that were already past. Her mother was past. Her mother had said what her mother had needed to say. Neve did not know yet whether she would ask her to come back. She did not know yet whether she would forgive her. She did know that her mother had told her the truth, and that the truth had been harder than any lie her mother could have told, and that this counted for something. It would take time to know how much. The grand opening of Slatebrook Junction Coffee was held on the second Saturday in May, on a clear, warm evening with the leaves just out and the dogwoods blooming along the railbed. Conrad had hung a string of small, white electric lights along the eaves of the platform, run from a generator he had brought down in his truck. Margaret had baked 4 loaves of dark bread. Wendell had brought the porcelain PRR coffee mugs out of his attic, all 12 of them. Stefania had driven down from Scranton with a pot of galabki and a tray of poppy seed cake. Daniel Raskovic had come, and so he had his wife. Ellsworth Penrose had come walking with a cane now, but unwilling to admit that he needed it, and so had the other 6 of the 8 railroad men who had rebuilt the freight room roof in January. Father Cyril from the small Catholic church in the village had come, and he had blessed the building before the supper, in the brief, informal way of a country priest who knew how to bless things without making a production of it. There were 27 people at the supper. They sat at 3 long plank tables that Conrad had built and set up in the waiting room, with the pot-bellied stove glowing softly at the end and the bay window above them open to the spring evening. The food was passed family style. The conversation was the conversation of a community that had just come through a long winter together, which is the best kind of conversation there is. After the supper, the older people went home in the long blue twilight, and the younger ones helped Neve clean up, and by 10 o'clock, the depot was quiet again, and Neve was alone in the waiting room with the embers in the stove and the strings of white lights still glowing softly along the eaves outside. She walked into the ticket booth. She sat on the wooden stool behind the agent's desk. She took her grandfather Declan's silver pocket watch off its leather cord and laid it on the desk beside Ezekiel Pritchard's Hamilton 992B. She wound them both. She set them both to railroad time. She watched them tick together for a long minute. Both watches read exactly the same time, accurate to the second set, the way they had been carried by men who had spent their lives believing that knowing the time was a kind of duty owed to other people. She thought about her grandfather Declan, who had ridden cabooses through every kind of Pennsylvania weather for 32 years. She thought about her father Cillian, who had walked out of an insurance office on a Monday morning in 2003 because the coat had felt like someone else's. She thought about her great-grandfather Patrick Reardon, who had stood on this platform in June of 1932, holding the hand of his small son Eamon, and who had walked 4 miles home in November of 1933 with $1,200 stolen from him by a family that had finally been called to account 93 years later. She thought about her great-uncle Eamon, who had gone on the section gang at 16 so that her grandfather could finish 9th grade, and who had ridden the Bedford branch alongside Declan in the same years that Ezekiel Pritchard had been making coffee in the booth where Neve now sat. She thought about Ezekiel, who had hidden a journal in the bottom drawer of this desk in 1958 because he had believed that someone someday would read it and who had been right. And she thought about her mother walking back along the railbed in March in a wool coat that did not quite fit, who had told her the truth for the first time in 13 months. She picked up the Hamilton. She held it in her palm. She felt the weight of it. She listened to its small, patient ticking. "Mr. Pritchard," she said softly in the empty ticket booth, "I kept my promise. I do not know if I have done as much as you would have did, but I have done what I could. The depot is warm. The coffee is good. The journal is in the township archive where the families can read it. I have done what I could." She set the Hamilton back on the desk. She stood up. She walked through the waiting room and out onto the platform. She sat on the white oak bench Conrad had built her, and she looked out at the long rail bed running away into the spring twilight, the same rail bed her great-grandfather had walked along on opening day in 1932, the same rail bed her grandfather had ridden as a brakeman on temporary assignment in 1953, the same rail bed she had walked 4 miles down in February of 2026 with $10 in her pocket and a duffel bag and a leather cord around her neck. A small breeze moved through the clearing. It carried the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke and the faint sweet smell of the dogwoods. Somewhere up the valley a whippoorwill called. Neve closed her eyes. In her memory, just for a moment, she heard the long, slow whistle of a freight train coming in from Bedford at 6:42 in the evening, calling the small junction to attention. She heard the low rumble of the diesel and the answering call of the agent's bell on the platform, and the voice of a station agent who had been dead for 63 years saying eastbound on time. She heard her grandfather's boots on the gravel of the railbed. She heard her father saying her name from somewhere in the trees. She heard her great-grandfather Patrick coughing the cough he had carried out of the coal patch and into the tunnels of his lungs for 20 years. She heard her great-uncle Amon, 16 years old in 1949, swinging a track sledge in a section gang summer. She heard them all at once, and she heard them separately, and she heard them as a single sound, which was the sound of a small American railroad junction in the foothills of central Pennsylvania at the close of a working day. In any year of the century when the trains had still come, she opened her eyes. The railbed was empty. The whippoorwill called once more. The Hamilton was on the desk inside ticking. Her grandfather's watch was on her chest ticking. The depot was warm and tight and full of the lingering smell of bread and coffee and good food. The string of white lights glowed softly along the eaves. Slatebrook Junction was open. She had been 20 when she walked 4 miles down a county road in February of 2026 with $10 in her pocket. She had been 20 when she had laid the silver pocket watch on the agent's desk and noticed that the floorboards beneath the stool did not match. She had been 21 for almost 6 months now. She had spent her last $10 on an abandoned train depot and at the end of a forgotten branch lying in the Allegheny foothills of central Pennsylvania. And what she had found in the ticket booth had changed everything that came after. It was the best $10 she had ever spent. She sat on the bench for a long time, watching the railbed in the blue twilight, listening to the watches tick and the small station that had been waiting for her since June of 1958 finally settled down around her in the warm spring night with the long, quiet contentment of a building that had at last found the person it had been waiting for. The whistle in her memory faded. The whippoorwill called a third time farther away now. The first stars came out over the eastern ridge. Neve Riordan stood up from the bench. She walked back into the depot. She closed the door behind her. The white lights on the eaves stayed lit. Inside, the kettle was already heating for the morning's coffee.